That brings us swiftly into our final theme around the EV transition. You know, we've been talking about, you know, electric vehicles for years, but 2025 was really the year where we saw EVs really surge. In the US alone, General Motors had more than doubled its EV output compared to the years before. And in Europe and China, EVs are now reaching a significant share of total vehicle production. But this EV boom has come with a lot of logistics challenges. Transporting EV batteries is definitely tricky. The charging infrastructure for carriers is still lacking, and the weight and dimensions of EVs often force companies to reduce load factors, fewer vehicles per truck or ship, and, you know, adjusting routes to avoid weight limits, which can mean really kind of costly impacts and definitely low efficiency. And it's not just outbound logistics. On the inbound logistics side, the EV production has its own headaches, moving lithium-ion batteries from gigafactories to assembly plants, often across continents under strict safety regulations. So this year, we saw OEMs using more ocean and rail transport for batteries, developing special packaging solutions and training staff in hazmat handling. Some even localized battery pack assemblies closer to their vehicle plants to avoid that shipping high voltage packs over those long distances. But while there are challenges, the EV transition definitely did spark a lot of logistics innovation. Some companies are establishing brand new processes and facilities tailored to EVs. One particularly interesting concept is the EV Fulfillment Center from GM. And Marcio Lucon, GM's Executive Director of Global Logistics and Containers, really introduced this idea to us in an interview we did in August and later on at an event in Detroit. So I want to jump in straight and look at Marcio's red sofa with us, where he really kind of tears up where the company is with their EV transition.
What are some of the ways that you're working in vehicle logistics within the network and with your partners to manage those value fluctuations?
So EV, there's a lot of things that are similar and a lot of things that require a different approach. And I would say on the inbound, there is all the battery transportation requires completely different way that when you move an exhaust. I think this we have a pretty good setup in GM. It's all local, all US with high tech knowledge. And that we need to manage just the volume goes up or goes down, the volatility. When you go to the finished vehicles, there is again similar things, but two main issues that we see differently than other ICE vehicles. One is heavy. EV vehicles are more heavy, so the loading factor is different. So we need to plan in a different way how we do the loading planning for this distribution. Second, there are more uncertainty in the market. So for example, when you're gonna play with full-size trucks on the ICE vehicles, we know the business, we know the dealers, we know the colors, we play really well, we make a plan and this works perfectly. In EV, if we do the same, we're gonna move all the risk to the dealers, which is there's kind of uncertainty and volatility in the final customers. So we developed what we call EV fulfillment centers, which are special places that we keep the EVs, and the dealers can pull from there. So they have availability, they can quickly react, because a EV customer, if they lose the window, you basically lose the sale. And at the same time, they don't carry all the instability of the market. This is an initial stage that's very aligned with the commercial operation, and now you are optimizing this group and try to move them inside our VDC in a way that we have EV specific requirements inside our old VDC operations. And so this is working really well. And I'd say GM is performing really strong. We believe on EV, that's our future strategy. And we have a very strong portfolio, either for ICE or for EV. The customer can pick what they want, and you're gonna be the right products. And we have been performing almost double than last year. So we are very strong second play in the market and moving in the right direction. And you'll never be able to do that without the right logistics, either inbound or outbound.
So I'm now very pleased to bring on a very familiar face from the automotive logistics team, Christopher Ludwig, our Chief Content Officer. Chris, welcome. It wouldn't be a live stream or an event or anything automotive logistics if we didn't have you with us. So I'm glad to have you here.
No, it's very good. It's very good to be here, and obviously excellent to see you hosting and sharing all this insight with our audience. So
Thank
it's a
you.
pleasure. It's also good to see the different faces I wore this year. So from beard to no beard, maybe coming back a bit now. That's the big news, I think. In the
I know.
industry,
We got
right?
a lot of comments on the beard.
Yeah, I can
It's
imagine.
funny. Another trend of 2025, Chris's beard. But I want to kind of go back and loop on to some of the things that Marcio shared there. He really talked in that clip about the EV transition, but he really did also in his wider, interview with us back in August and also on the Red Sofa. He did echo some of the things that Martin was also mentioning around, supply chain taking more of a strategic role within the business. So I want to get your thoughts a little bit on, how you see that fitting into kind of the year's story this year, and where you think this trend will continue to go forward.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think what Marcio Luson's one of his main points in coming into the role at GM was to kind of raise the influence that logistics has in strategic decisions. As he always said, having a seat at the table, being in the room where decisions are being made. Clearly, as we talked about earlier with Martin, I'm sure we can touch on again, that supply chain and logistics can be that orchestrator of information. It's almost like a neutral view that brings together information from across the supply chain and helps to make the best possible decision, not just on cost. Obviously, sometimes it could be a total cost picture, and often is. But if you just look at cost alone, you might be missing the inventory picture, the time to market, the financing aspects that come into it, the trim levels, a whole host of things. So I think you need a party that can bring that together. And as you alluded to earlier, where the data can be centralized with the tools that can help scenario plan that, which can help us better understand that, are important. I think what's also interesting, or probably important to note, if we're putting that then in the context of the EV transition, and they're like so much in the supply chain. I think Martin said it earlier, right? Having to succeed in ambiguity and volatility. I think nothing captures that better than the EV transition right now. General Motors, as you mentioned, or as Marcio mentioned, big growth in EV this year, maybe up until half year point or even up into the third quarter. But of course, General Motors, like many in the industry, knew that a change was coming because the regulation was changing in the US with an incentive going out. So there was perhaps a pull forward in demand, which now will shift. Doesn't mean that demand goes away, but it shifts. The supply chain and logistics needs to be able to respond to, let's call them inorganic demand signals or changing demand signals. Regulation driving it up, then pulling it down. And how do you avoid a big bottleneck or bullwhip in the supply chain, which could result in overcapacity, undercapacity? So this is such a big story in the whole EV transition, and I think it relates very well to how the role that logistics and supply chain plays in managing through this volatility. Can't see the future always, but can see a demand signal, can scenario plan, and be ready to help manage that.
Yeah, no, thank you. We didn't manage to see, a news Red Sofa in full there, but I know there was a part one and a part two, and you interviewed him at both FBL and on site at Global. And I just want to touch on, like, he was talking about the reality that these things don't shift over, that localization element doesn't shift overnight. And, some are kind of responding to the tariffs with localization, but we also heard GM at one of our events talking about industrializing North America with a more regional supplier footprint. So kind of in your view, how do you see 2025 moving closer to that true local for local production and sourcing, and kind of maybe giving a bit of an overview as well, but kind of what Anu was referring to as well.
So how many more hours do we have?
We can have this as a whole segment.
Yeah, no, of course we can. No, but it's such an important point. And I guess to try and cut through on one level, and something Anu was saying, and I know it got a bit cut off, but one of his key messages, both on the service parts, but also on the vehicle logistics side, is, the decision was made. Volkswagen made the decision. Many made the decision, if you look in the US, to keep shipping. and to keep providing service or vehicles, even though the tariff costs went up. And then initially in April, based on like on off again, there was maybe a hope that maybe it would change, and so maybe we hold back. But ultimately, the decision was, no, if we don't continue to produce and move, we'll lose market share. So that was a strategic decision, exactly for the reasons that you said. You can't pivot, you can't localize overnight. The quickest you can maybe do is move a vehicle which is produced in two locations, like we see with Nissan, produce Rogue in Japan and in the US. Now it's increasing the US production, but even that is maybe 6 months to a year to make that shift, because you have tooling capacity, you have volume plans, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't do it overnight. But going back to our earlier point on orchestration, the decision of it's in the company's interest, based on the goals we align on, to pay this extra cost right now in tariffs right now. But over time, you will see that industrial footprint start to shift. And GM is a good example. If this is public, 4 billion invested in the US. We're starting to see some models which shift, from different locations. And there, I mean, the full picture of that is not fully revealed. Just this past week, they've announced additional investment in some component plants and tooling plants, because that has to happen bit by bit. If you just move the vehicle without starting to move your tooling and components, then you're also, you have a longer supply chain and perhaps disjointed. And of course, there are potential tariffs on that side too, but it wouldn't fit the local for local. So again, to avoid going on for hours and hours, like I said, I think
Don't worry, part two coming in
part two
January.
coming in January, so we'll save some of that. But as said, I think strategic decision to pay literally billions, as we see, in extra tariff costs to maintain a market share and start to position the supply chain. And logistics, of course, has to support that decision and be ready to adapt in between. And what becomes really critical is having the right information in the right place to at least mitigate where you can. Right? What can you mitigate? What can you offset? Make sure USMCA compliance, etc. So again, we a lot more detail on that, but I think that's a little bit of a snapshot.
For sure, a lot more detail on that to come. It will all be on automotive logistics on the website, in our events and our conferences, for sure. But before I touch on some of the digitalization aspects that we've been talking around control towers, data hubs, AI, especially around some of the things that Martin touched on, we have some questions coming in from the audience, and I think it'll be a good one to kind of understand how much progress has been made on kind of the battery passport front, and will digital twins be a key aspect in that implementation in your view?
Yeah, I mean, the battery passport, we can look into that more. I think on the one hand, what I see is this is related to a push across the industry to map the supply chain more. Now, there are different examples of maybe in this case using, I think Volvo has tried to use blockchain to validate across the battery passport side. Container X, as you mentioned earlier, Container X has a use case for battery passport, which is being used. I don't think we see it in its full implementation yet. But if I can transition it a little bit more, is an absolutely key strategic message. And we had this just last week in Munich at our digital strategies conference, is having that tier N visibility. We see it from Nexperia, from that looming crisis, from critical minerals, from many things. The Novelis fire, the aluminium supplier fire, which has impact across the supply chain. That might not be in OEMs tier one, or it might be a tier two or tier three in some cases. But if you don't see what where the supplies are coming from, you're at greater risk of disruption. That's one side. That's the sort of supply chain risk side. But on the battery passport and related, whether it's forced labor or other requirements that are coming in the EU and the US, we need to be able to show at the border or in import processes that certain vehicles or products don't contain certain materials that violate certain laws, human rights, etc. There's a whole host of these aspects, and likely to get more complex. EU deforestation rules delayed a few times, but battery passport, maybe the implementation gets delayed, but these things are coming. And the USMCA, for example, already has a high labor and rules of origin. In the new version negotiation, maybe this gets even more aggressive. How will OEMs, tier ones, be able to show the origins of their parts, prove certification? This is a big driver of digitalization. I think you mentioned it, or there was an OEM who mentioned it earlier in the year. The single biggest driver of OEM of AI use in certain departments is absolutely compliance, and how do you actually certify and validate these things?
Yeah, for sure. That was Ford.
Yes, it
Really
was.
like re-emphasizing that at
Yeah.
the digital strategies North America event. Yeah, well, that is a good segue into, because I did want to talk more about, you know, this wave of digitalization. You just mentioned that we've come back from an event last week in Europe, specifically focused on that and looking at increased visibility. Can you give a little bit more context of some of those kind of key takeaways from that, some of the biggest opportunities in digitalization right now?
Yeah, and again, I think we've seen on the one hand, acceleration of use, obviously AI interest everywhere, Gen AI, agentic AI. But before I go into maybe some of the use cases, that I think the foundational work that needs to be done is becoming quite clear and pretty agreed across the
Hmm.
industry. So whether you're, as Martin would have talked about, whether you're working with a 3PL, 4PL, and maybe have a partner which you're going to digitalize things, or you're doing more of this yourself, either way, the first and foremost thing is to have the data standardized across your supply chain, right?
Hmm.
So do you actually have coherent semantic data which is semantically comprehensible across different departments, between OEM, LSP, supplier? Is it Excel based, or is it EDI? I mean, the whole host of different ways. It doesn't really matter the single tool, but it needs to be in a data lake or in some way brought together. That's the first and foremost, because if you start running machine learning based on inaccurate data and then Gen AI, I mean, you just get, there's a four-letter word we could use, in out, and that's just called garbage in, garbage out. So that first and foremost has to happen, and we see that really happening. So examples of data lakes and of command centers or control towers, etc. So I think that's a kind of solid level to deal with the day to day, and then move to other examples. Again, I won't go too deep into all the examples I heard last week, but where we're really starting to see AI, particularly Gen AI and now autonomous agents with use cases, has been in things like documentation. So RFQs, customs, lots of procurement processes where you can, maybe like chat with the variety of different offers there, and then BMW gave us a really good example, and there's a video we can of course share afterwards, and they're of
Definitely,
using,
it's live now
yeah, it's live
on the
now
red sofa.
on the AL
Yeah.
site, of using agentic AI to check inventory of tooling assets at different suppliers. And this is so far an agent which has been given delegated authority to basically complete a manual task. It's exactly that intelligent automation
Mm.
that you mentioned. It's a really interesting example, but the next step, and this is what Alda Vaganza, who leads supplier digitalization and procurement digitalization at BMW, said, the real win will be when an OEM's agents and a tier one's agents and a logistics provider agents can communicate with one another and talk about and sort of execute key tasks. It's not there yet. Maybe it needs a container X to
Mm.
get there, or different data standards. Maybe it's others, but I think that's sort of the roadmap that we're starting to
Mm.
see emerge. If I were to, again, maybe just point to highlight around that.
Yeah, perfect. I wanted to bring back Martin onto the screen, but we are running to time. So I'm just going to stick with Chris. And I know there have been questions here directly for Martin. So Martin, if you're still with us on the back end, we will get them to you. And it's definitely been a pleasure to have you with us. And it was great to hear your insights 9 months on from the red sofa. And we will definitely see you again in Bonn. But Chris, to kind of sign us off, I mentioned at the beginning, we have core themes on that we follow on automotive logistics, and just three of those are around regionalization, digitalization, and electrification. But a theme for me, and I know for you through our conversations, is that supply chain leaders' role in the industry is becoming more pivotal than ever. So how do you see kind of supply chain leaders going into 2026? Kind of what is your advice for them to wrap us up on some of this? It's a big question to end on. So
Yeah, well, that definitely feels like one where it's good to have at least Martin watching and with us, because this is something he and I actually talk about a lot, in terms of, again, that role and function that the supply chain or supply chain leaders, call it chief supply chain officers, whatever you want to call the role, should play. And it goes back again to that sort of orchestration, bringing that data points together, helping to make the right decision. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they make the decisions, because um, it's sort of down to a strong aligned S&OP process to bring
Mm.
the right decision makers and choose the priorities. So it's not necessarily a supply chain chooses, but supply chain puts the best possible scenarios on the table. And when we think about 2026, I don't know what to predict, but I can be sure you expect the unexpected and be ready for the unexpected. So your scenario planning needs to be aligned to the fact that we might see, another evolution in the tariff situation. We'll likely see some shift in EV policy incentives one way or another.
Mhm.
Um, don't expect the geopolitical tensions between, the U.S., China, others to just dissipate,
Mm.
right? And what direction they're going to take, we don't know, but we need to be ready for that, and what suppliers will catch fire, unfortunately, over the
Yeah, a
next
few
year.
of
But
those have happened,
we need to
unfortunately.
be ready for it. But I think and maybe just the last point, one point that I think has been so important across many of our events and our discussions. There are very few parts of the world right now where you can rely on unabated absolute growth expectation. There's very few markets that are going just like this.
Mm.
Not the US, not Europe, not China. Markets are either going like this or more likely going like this. And anyone who wants to succeed or needs to succeed in the supply chain or logistics right now needs to know how to add value, not just when you're rising, but when you're going up and down and up and down. And that comes down to many of the tools we've been talking about. It comes down to the resiliency. It comes down to the people. Maybe we haven't
Mm.
spoken enough about that in this live stream. And certainly, if any transition digitalization to a strong supply chain
Mhm.
organization, it comes down to the skills, talent, mindset of the people working in those organizations, and they need to be able to add value exactly in that disruption. So that's sort of I think, a positive note, even though it's a realistic note perhaps, but an absolute important note for us to kind of end on here and
Yeah.
think about the road ahead.
No, definitely. You're very aligned with Martin. He also ended on the people front. So it's great that we're aligned with the real experts out there. So thank you, Chris, for doing a live wrap up with us here on our very last live stream of the year. But before we sign off, just a quick announcement and maybe a few acknowledgements that even though this is our final live stream of 2025, we will be back in 2026 in January with a whole new series of live events, bringing more exclusive insights from across the automotive supply chain. In fact, we mentioned it here. We'll be doing a part 2. So January will be looking more on the forward-looking predictions, keeping an eye out across all of what we'll be writing about in the lead up to that on automotive logistics, and then also join us live or kind of on demand after. We have some great content lined up for us next year. And also, to stay informed, be sure to also check out our 2026 media pack and editorial calendar. Those are live, and whichever medium you prefer, whether that's online articles, magazines, live stream, video articles, live exclusive wrap ups here with myself and Chris. We will have that for you, and make sure that we keep delivering that core content for you that offers you value in times of a lot of change and uncertainty. But with that, I just want to say one last thank you to Marta Corner for joining us live, and to our contributors as well, Anu a new goal, Peter Hernleim, Marcio Lucon, and of course to our very own Christopher Ludwig for sharing his experiences and their experiences live with us today. And despite the challenges of 2025 that was really thrown at us this year, the automotive logistics community has definitely shown incredible resilience, creativity, and collaboration. The story of 2025 is ultimately one that definitely looks at adapting and overcoming. And I believe that puts us on a stronger footing for 2026 and beyond. On behalf of the entire automotive logistics team, I wish you a very wonderful holiday season and a very happy new year ahead. We look forward to seeing you online and in person at our events in 2026. But until next time, thank you and goodbye.